direct their fire across the harbor.
In the autumn of 1940, at the early stages of World War II, the British had seen off a possible German invasion by defeating the Luftwaffe in what became known as the Battle of Britain. This had deprived the Germans of air superiority over the British mainland. But this had come at a terrible cost, with the RAF losing just over 1,000 fighter aircraft. The trade mission had already been sent to the United States to buy up what aircraft it could. And though at this stage the US was still neutral, their president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was very sympathetic to the British cause and declared, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." One of the first aircraft to be purchased by the British was the U.S. Brewster Buffalo, rather unspectacular carrier and a land-based fighter. The British Royal Navy took over a small number of them that had been designed for Belgian air forces, but they were never delivered due to Germany's successful invasion of the country in May 1940. The British Fleet Air Arm used them briefly, and they saw action in the Mediterranean during the Battle of Crete in early 1941, before being replaced by far more capable British Supermarine Seafires and the U.S. Grumman Wildcats. The RAF received 170 of the export version of the Buffalo F-2A-2 and used them in the Far East, where they would later see action against the Japanese at the beginning of 1942. The British found these aircrafts to be lacking in all ways, but felt that they were better than nothing. They thought that the Buffalo was too lightly armed, with the armament of just 4 heavy machine guns, and had no advanced features like armor protection or self-sealing tanks. It was also slow, had a poor rate of climb, and suffered from constant engine overheating and maintenance problems. So they were soon phased out of service for more modern types like the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The British also ordered and received some Bell P-39 Cobras. It was acquired in very small numbers by the RAF. This was a relatively new aircraft design, and the RAF found once it came into service with them in the summer of 1941 that it was very underpowered due to it having a non-turbo supercharged engine, as well as it having extremely poor performance at high altitude, and it also had numerous serviceability issues. The RAF ended up briefly equipping just 1 squadron with Cobras, before deciding in early 1942 to gift them all to the Soviet Union, who used them pretty successfully in the ground attack role. The British had much more success with their newly introduced Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, which it called the Tomahawk, and later versions the Kitty Hawk. They started to enter RAF service in early 1941, and they would go on to equip 18 RAF squadrons. Though it was inferior in combat to the German Me-109 and FW-190 fighters, the P-40 did well in the North African campaign from 1941 to 1943, where the Axis fighters were few and far between, and the Italian were using particularly obsolete aircraft designs. By the following year, 1942, the RAF's fighter force was becoming more and more overstretched as the North African campaign heated up against the Germany and Italian forces stationed there. But despite a successful reorganization of British aircraft manufacturing industry, Britain still lacked the ability to mass-produce the number of fighter aircraft needed to equip the ever-expanding RAF with Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm and meet the newly emerged threat of Japan, which it had gone to war with in September 1941. The British Purchasing Commission had approached back in April 1940 James H. Dutch Kindelberger of North American Aviation about the company producing under license the Curtiss P-40 Warhawks for them. North American Aviation was a relative newcomer to aircraft manufacturing, and up until their only real success with trainer aircrafts, which included the legendary T-6 Texan, a single-engined advanced trainer aircraft. Despite this, Kindelberger had suggested that the North American Aviation instead designed a totally new fighter for the British government, as it had felt that the P-40 was already becoming outdated and had limited development potential. And also, Kindelberger hated the idea of producing another company's design, which would result in having no control over its development. Surprisingly, and most likely due to desperation, the Commission agreed to its proposal. And remarkably, in just 7 months, Kindelberger team had designed, built, tested, and supplied the RAF with the new Mustang Mark I. These began entering operational service in January 1942, and 620 in the end were delivered to the RAF. It was used as a tactical reconnaissance aircraft and as a fighter bomber. Because its U.S. Allison engine meant it was only effective at low altitude. They also suffered from regular ammunition jams, windshields that were prone to frosting up, and they constantly suffered problems of the type of propeller used. The next major development was the A-36 Apache, of which 500 were built. It was introduced into service in the middle of 1942, and it went on to see action in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia with the RAF and U.S. Army Air Force. before being phased out of service in 1944. In service, the A-36 was used in the ground attack role, being capable of a respectable 365 miles per hour, despite using a version of the Allison engine that the RAF Mustang Mark I was fitted with, but it did mean that the A-36 performance deteriorated badly the higher that it flew. Its 6 heavy machine guns in the wings were able to carry up to 1,000 pounds or 454 kilograms of bombs on 2 underwing hardpoints. And they were put to good use when attacking ground targets. Over time, it gained a reputation for precision bombing, as well as being a sturdy and silent killer. But it also had some serious shortcomings that threatened to relegate the entire P-51 program to being just a temporary short-term stopgap design. It couldn't be upgraded with no cannon armament, which that was really needed to destroy medium to heavy tanks. And though its range wasn't bad, it wasn't that impressive either. Its canopy field of vision was very limited, to the extent that the rear view was almost non-existent. It also had a very poorly protected radiator, which meant that just a single bullet hit on it could cause the engine to rapidly overheat. But many still had a lot of faith in the overall design, arguing that it had been designed as a fighter, and therefore it needed further development to reach its full potential. The turning point for the P-51 program came in 1943, when the USAAF increased dramatically the number of its daylight bomber raids into Germany. Though the B-17 and the B-24 heavy bombers were incredible aircrafts, with up to 13 heavy machine guns for protection, and its crews were trained to form up into box formations for mutual self-defense, they were nevertheless very vulnerable when their escorting fighters, even with drop tanks, could only escort them some way to their targets. So quickly, the USAAF and the RAF bomber losses were so heavy that there was serious talk of abandoning or scaling back on the bombing campaign, even though it was clearly starting to work as it slowly crippled the German economy. It wasn't helping that the aircrafts like the FW-190, armed with 20mm cannons and anti-aircraft underwing rockets, were incredibly good at wreaking havoc on Allied bomber formations. And when they did meet the escorting P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolts, the FW-190 and later variant Me-109s were more than a match for them. So the US turned to North American aviation, and they frantically worked on rectifying the Mustangs and Apache's shortcomings in order to bring out the design's full potential as a long-range air superiority fighter. They came up in record time with a vastly improved Mustang. First came the P-51Bs and Cs. Both known as Mustang 3s in RAF service, they were the first Mustangs to be powered by a modified British Merlin engine, which transformed the Mustang into a potent killing machine at high altitudes, and all altitudes. It had its fuel capacity increased, so in addition to the engine being more powerful, it also burned considerably less fuel than its predecessors, which meant that it now had an incredibly long range. These variants were quickly put into production, with eventually 3,700 being built, and from late 1943 they started escorting US bombers as they carried out raids over Germany. They were soon joined in mid-1944 by the definitive variant of the Mustang, the legendary P-51D, known in RAF service as the Mustang 4. 8,200 of these were produced. This variant was the first with the iconic teardrop canopy, which offered far better vision all around, as well as much more refined aerodynamic styling. Soon, US bomber raids were being escorted by these new Mustangs, and they were ripping apart the German air defenses, even holding its own against formidable Me-262 jet fighters that had started to appear in limited numbers from April 1944 onwards. A total of 15,000 P-51s of all types were built, and it's credited over Europe to have destroyed around 5,000 enemy aircraft. This resulted in an impressive kill ratio of 11-1. It was less involved in the Pacific and China theater of operations, where carrier aircraft of older land-based Allied types were more commonly used. Nevertheless, the P-51 destroyed around 650 Japanese enemy aircraft during the war. After the war, the P-51 continued in service for a number of years in the now US Air Force. It even saw action in the Korean War that ran between 1950 and 1953 in the close support role. The US finally phased the majority of its P-51s out of service by the beginning of 1957. There was an attempt in the 1970s to develop the P-51 even further by producing a heavily improved and modified version. This was called the Piper PA-48 Enforcer, and it was a turboprop-powered close air support aircraft. It ultimately proved unsuccessful, and it never went into service. The last operator of the P-51s was the Dominican Air Force, who finally retired theirs in 1984. Enjoy some of our other videos, like the Butcher Bird.